Sometimes, life tests the very core of our dignity before it shows us the true strength hidden inside us. And sometimes, those who are dismissed as nothing become the ones who inspire everyone. This is the story of Joseph, a humble young man whose journey began with humiliation, but who would one day transform that wound into something greater than anyone could have imagined. Joseph had always lived a modest life. He grew up in a small neighborhood, the son of hardworking parents who never had much but gave him the values of honesty, kindness, and perseverance. His clothes were never new, but always clean. His shoes were worn but polished. He carried himself with quiet dignity, even though the world rarely noticed him. From a young age, Joseph dreamed of working for a great company, not because he wanted to be rich, but because he wanted to bring stability to his family. His father's health had begun to decline, and his mother worked long hours to put food on the table. Joseph knew it was his turn to shoulder responsibility. He wasn't looking for pity. He wasn't looking for shortcuts. He simply wanted an opportunity. One morning, Joseph woke up early, the sun barely rising above the rooftops. He had borrowed an old suit from his uncle, one that didn't quite fit his slender frame, but he adjusted it the best he could. He looked in the cracked mirror of his small bedroom, tightened his tie, and whispered to himself, "This is the day. I just need one chance." The company he was going to apply for was one of the largest in the city. Its tall glass buildings seemed to touch the sky, a place of dreams for many, a place where people walked in wearing confidence and walked out with pride. For Joseph, it was intimidating, but he walked toward it with hope burning in his chest. When he entered the lobby, everything seemed larger than life. The marble floors, the golden elevators, the crisp suits of the employees rushing past him. He clutched his small folder of documents, his resume carefully typed out, though simple compared to the glossy portfolios others carried. He approached the front desk with a polite smile and asked where to submit his application. They directed him upstairs to the manager's office. And that was where Joseph's fate, at least for that day, would take a cruel turn. The manager was a woman named Claire. She was known for her sharp tongue and her belief that only the finest, most polished individuals belonged in her company. Appearance mattered to her as much as skill, maybe more. When Joseph walked in, she barely looked up from her desk. "Yes? What do you want?" she asked flatly. Joseph swallowed nervously and replied, "Good morning, ma'am. I came to apply for the position you advertised. I've brought my resume." She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his oversized suit, his slightly scuffed shoes, the nervous way he held his folder. And then she smirked. "You think you belong here?" she said with a laugh that wasn't kind. "Look around, young man. This is not a place for people like you." Her words stung, each syllable slicing through Joseph's heart, but he held his ground. "Ma'am, I may not look the part, but I am hardworking and I learn quickly. I only need a chance to prove myself." Claire rolled her eyes. "Save your speech. We don't need charity cases here. We need professionals. You should go find some small shop or maybe a place where expectations aren't so high." She waved her hand as though shooing away a stray dog. Joseph's chest tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to say that worth was not measured by suits or wealth, but by dedication and integrity. But the lump in his throat silenced him. He nodded slowly, his eyes downcast, and whispered, "Thank you for your time." As he turned to leave, he heard Claire chuckle under her breath, and the sound burned into his memory like fire. When Joseph stepped out of that glass building, the city no longer seemed welcoming. The bright sky looked gray, and the bustling streets felt suffocating. He sat down on a bench near the bus stop, staring at his resume, the edges crumpled now from the way he had gripped it in his hand. For a moment, hopelessness threatened to consume him. But then he remembered his mother's voice, gentle but firm, always reminding him, "Joseph, the world may try to break you, but you must never let it define you. You are more than their opinions." He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and told himself, "This is not the end. It's only the beginning. One day, they will see who I really am." And with that, Joseph stood up, straightened his shoulders, and began walking, not knowing that this moment of humiliation was planting the seed for a future more extraordinary than he could have ever dreamed. Because sometimes, life doesn't give us what we want right away. Sometimes it first gives us pain to build the strength we will need to carry the blessings waiting ahead. And Joseph's journey was only beginning. Joseph walked home that evening with the weight of rejection pressing down on his shoulders like a sack of stones he could not set down. The streets blurred before his eyes as tears fought to surface, but he forced them back, unwilling to let the world see the pain of a young man who had dared to dream only to be crushed in front of strangers. The laughter of children playing on the sidewalks, the hum of cars, and the chatter of people seemed to come from another world. A world that had no space for him, no space for his struggle, no space for the dignity he was desperately trying to hold on to. He reached the small, worn-down apartment where he lived with his mother, a woman whose face carried both the gentleness of unconditional love and the deep lines of years spent enduring hardship. The moment Joseph stepped inside, she looked at him with searching eyes, as if she already knew what had happened. Mothers often do. She didn't ask immediately. Instead, she motioned for him to sit down at the wooden table that wobbled on one side and poured him a cup of tea, though she herself hadn't eaten anything since morning. Finally, in a voice that was steady yet heavy, she asked, "How did it go, Joseph?" And he broke. The words spilled out of him, the waiting, the nervousness, the hope, and finally, the cruelty of being humiliated for daring to want more. He told her how the manager had mocked his clothes, his lack of experience, and even the way he carried himself. Every detail cut deeper as he repeated it, but his mother didn't interrupt. She listened, her hand gently resting on his, her silence giving him the space to let out the storm that had built up inside. When he finally finished, she took a deep breath and said something that would stay with him forever. "Joseph, people can take away your money, your opportunities, even your pride for a moment. But they can never take away your worth unless you let them. You are not defined by their laughter, nor by their rejection. You are defined by what you choose to do after." Joseph wanted to believe her, but the wound was fresh. Still, those words planted a seed that he didn't know would later bloom into something far greater than he could imagine. The next morning, while most people rushed to work, Joseph woke early, not because he had a job to go to, but because he had a decision to make. Would he let the humiliation destroy him, or would he find another path forward? He took out a small notebook he always carried, one where he wrote ideas, thoughts, and sometimes just simple words that inspired him. Flipping through its pages, he saw sketches of designs, notes about how businesses worked, and quotes he had copied from books borrowed from the library. An idea began to form. If no one wanted to give him a chance, maybe he could create his own. But to do that, he needed to learn more, to push himself further than ever before. So Joseph went back to the library, day after day. He sat in the corners, reading books about business, management, customer service, and even psychology. He took notes feverishly, studied late into the night, and when exhaustion tried to pull him down, he remembered his mother's words. "You are not defined by their rejection." The world outside seemed to move faster than he could keep up. Friends from his neighborhood found jobs. Others left for better opportunities, while Joseph stayed in his little apartment, carrying books under his arm, working odd jobs just to keep food on the table. He cleaned floors, carried boxes, and repaired small things for neighbors, all while dreaming of the day he could prove that he was capable of more. Months passed, but Joseph's determination only grew stronger. Then, one afternoon, fate took an unexpected turn. He was walking through town when he noticed a commotion near the same company where he had once been humiliated. People were gathered outside, their voices rising in frustration. Curious, Joseph approached and overheard the complaints. Customers were angry because their orders were late, mistakes had been made, and no one inside seemed to care. The once well-regarded company was slipping, and its reputation was unraveling in public. Joseph stood there, his heart pounding. The memory of that day he was laughed at returned like a punch to the chest, but alongside it came something else, a spark of realization. He could see the mistakes they were making, mistakes he had read about, mistakes he knew how to fix. He felt torn. Should he walk away and let them fail, Or should he take this as an opportunity to step into the very place that had once rejected him? That night, he couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the scene over and over. Finally, he sat at his desk and began to write. He created a detailed plan, a proposal outlining how the company could improve their customer service, streamline their processes, and rebuild trust with their clients. He poured everything he had learned into those pages, knowing full well that they might ignore him again, maybe even mock him once more. But he also knew he had nothing to lose. The next day, with trembling hands but steady resolve, Joseph walked back into that building. The receptionist recognized him and gave him a puzzled look, but he simply asked to leave a letter for the manager. He placed the neatly written plan inside an envelope, signed his name at the bottom, and walked out without expecting anything in return. What Joseph didn't know was that sometimes, life waits for the right moment to turn pain into purpose. Days later, the manager herself opened the envelope. At first, she scoffed when she saw the name, Joseph, the young man she had dismissed without a second thought. But as she began reading, her expression shifted. Line after line revealed not just knowledge, but insight, creativity, and a vision that far exceeded what she had expected from someone she had once ridiculed. The words pierced her pride, reminding her of her own failures, of the arrogance that had blinded her. She sat there in silence long after finishing, her heart unsettled by a mix of shame and admiration. Joseph had no idea that his words had planted another seed, this time inside the very person who had humiliated him. The days that followed seemed ordinary for Joseph. He continued his routine of small jobs, library visits, and late-night note-taking. He carried on with the quiet persistence of someone who had learned to expect little but give everything. Yet, unbeknownst to him, the envelope he had left behind was slowly rewriting the narrative of his life. Inside the company, the manager, whose name was Evelyn, couldn't shake off what she had read. She had skimmed through countless reports and proposals written by professionals over the years, but none had struck her with the same raw clarity as Joseph's. His plan wasn't polished in the corporate sense, but it was deeply practical, rooted in empathy, and filled with creative solutions that were refreshingly human. Evelyn kept the pages on her desk, reading them again and again, as though trying to understand the mind that had produced them. For the first time in years, she felt unsettled. Evelyn was a woman who had built her career on sharpness, confidence, and an air of superiority that often crossed into arrogance. She was feared, not admired. Yet Joseph's words held up a mirror she had never wanted to look into. They reminded her of her younger self, the girl who once dreamed of making a difference before ambition hardened her heart. One evening, unable to contain her thoughts, Evelyn called a private meeting with the board. She laid Joseph's plan on the table, presenting it as if it were her own discovery. The executives leaned in, intrigued by the freshness of the ideas. Discussions followed, debates sparked, and slowly, the realization grew that this plan could indeed save the company from its current decline. "Where did this come from?" one of them asked. Evelyn hesitated for a moment. The truth pressed on her chest, heavy and undeniable. "It was submitted by someone outside our company," she finally admitted. "A young man who once came here seeking a job." The executives exchanged skeptical glances. "Then why isn't he working for us already?" The question hit Evelyn harder than she expected. Why wasn't he? She remembered that day too vividly. The boy with nervous eyes, dressed in worn clothes, standing in front of her. She remembered the mocking tone in her own voice, the way she had dismissed him before even listening. She remembered the laughter, the way the room seemed to shrink around his humiliation. At the time, it had felt like nothing. Now it haunted her like a ghost. Meanwhile, Joseph remained unaware of the quiet storm brewing in those boardrooms. He carried firewood for a neighbor, swept the floors of a small grocery store, and fixed a leaky pipe for a friend of his mother. Each task, no matter how small, he treated with respect. He believed that dignity wasn't tied to the kind of work he did, but to the effort he gave. His mother noticed the change in his eyes, less despair, more determination, and she silently thanked God for the strength that had been poured into her son. Then, one afternoon, As Joseph returned home with dusty hands and tired feet, there was a knock at the door. His mother opened it, only to find a woman standing there in a neatly pressed suit, her expression taut with something between pride and humility. Joseph froze when he saw her. It was Evelyn. For a moment, silence filled the room. Joseph's jaw tightened, memories flooding back like open wounds. He could still hear the sound of her voice mocking him, still feel the sting of that rejection. He didn't know whether to speak or to walk away. Evelyn cleared her throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Joseph," she began, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I came to apologize." The words struck him like thunder. Apologize? From her? He blinked, uncertain if he had heard correctly. "I was wrong that day," Evelyn continued, her gaze steady though her hands betrayed a slight tremble. "I judged you unfairly, and worse, I humiliated you. That was not only unprofessional but cruel. I read the plan you submitted, and it was remarkable. It showed me a depth of understanding I failed to see in you because I was blinded by my own pride." Joseph's heart pounded. Part of him wanted to shout, to ask her why she had treated him that way, to demand an explanation for the pain she had caused. But another part of him, the part shaped by his mother's wisdom, urged him to listen. Evelyn took a deep breath. "The company is in trouble, Joseph. Your ideas are exactly what we need. I want you to come work with us, not as an errand boy, but as part of the team. I believe you can help us rebuild what we've lost." The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Joseph's mother looked at him, her eyes filled with quiet encouragement. This was the opportunity he had dreamed of, yet it came from the very person who had once crushed him. Finally, Joseph spoke, his voice calm but firm. "You laughed at me when I asked for a chance. Why should I believe you now?" Evelyn's composure faltered. She lowered her eyes. "Because I've realized that true leadership is not about arrogance, but about recognizing potential in others, even when it's hidden beneath circumstances. I failed you once. I don't want to fail again." There was sincerity in her words, a humility Joseph never expected to hear from her. Still, trust was not something he could give easily. He thought of his nights in the library, his sacrifices, his mother's constant support. He didn't owe Evelyn his gratitude. But perhaps this wasn't about her. It was about the path he had chosen for himself. After a long pause, Joseph nodded. "I'll help, but not for you. For myself. For the chance to prove that worth isn't defined by how someone looks when they walk through a door." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A smile not of victory but of relief. The next day, Joseph stepped into the company again, but this time not as a desperate applicant. He walked through the same doors with his head held high, holding not a resume but a vision. Employees glanced at him curiously, whispers following him down the hall, but Joseph ignored them. He wasn't there to seek approval. He was there to make a difference. As he began working alongside the team, something extraordinary happened. His ideas, once dismissed, now found a stage. His ability to connect with people, to understand their frustrations and needs, breathed new life into the company. Slowly, the chaos began to settle. Processes improved. Customers returned. And in the center of it all was Joseph, the same young man who had once been laughed at, now becoming the reason the company found hope again. Evelyn watched all of this unfold with a strange mix of pride and humility. She admired Joseph's brilliance, but even more, she admired his resilience. In his determination, she saw a strength that she had lost somewhere along the way. She found herself not just respecting him, but being inspired by him. And without realizing it, she began to change. Weeks passed, and Joseph's presence in the company became impossible to ignore. What had once been a sterile environment of clipped conversations and tense silence was now buzzing with ideas, collaboration, and a cautious optimism that no one had felt in years. It wasn't that Joseph held all the answers, far from it. What made him extraordinary was the way he listened, the way he made even the lowest-ranking employees feel seen and valued. For too long, the company had been ruled by fear. Evelyn's leadership style had demanded obedience, not creativity. Employees had learned to keep their heads down, to avoid mistakes rather than strive for brilliance. But Joseph, humble, genuine, curious, invited them to speak up. He asked the janitor for his opinion on building flow. He listened to the receptionist when she suggested small improvements for customer service. He treated the cafeteria staff with the same respect he gave to the executives. And soon, people began to believe again, not just in the company, but in themselves. Evelyn observed all of this with a quiet astonishment. She had always thought strength came from control, from reminding people who was in charge. But Joseph's strength was different. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was steady, unwavering, born of empathy. He had endured humiliation and still chosen kindness, had been denied respect and still offered it freely. And that kind of strength was contagious. One evening, after most employees had left, Evelyn found herself wandering into the conference room where Joseph sat alone, surrounded by papers and notes. He was scribbling something in his worn notebook, the same one he had carried when he first came begging for a job. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him for a moment. "You never stop working, do you?" she said softly. Joseph looked up, surprised, but offered a small smile. "When you grow up with little, you learn that hard work is the only thing you can control. Everything else is uncertain." His words pierced her in ways she didn't expect. She stepped closer, her voice hesitant. "I don't think I've ever thanked you for what you've done here. The company is changing. People are changing. And it's because of you." Joseph shook his head. "It's not because of me. It's because they finally believe their voices matter. I'm just reminding them of something they already knew deep down." Evelyn stared at him, humbled. For years, she had taken pride in her intelligence, her authority, her ability to command a room. But here was a young man who had none of those things in the traditional sense, yet he had accomplished what she never could. He had given life back to a place that had grown cold under her watch. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but reflective. Evelyn felt a strange warmth in her chest, a pull she didn't want to name. She pushed it aside, clearing her throat. "You know," she said lightly, "you're making me look bad." Joseph chuckled, shaking his head. "No, you gave me this chance. Without you, I'd still be outside those doors." But both of them knew that wasn't the whole truth. Evelyn hadn't given him a chance out of generosity. She had done it out of necessity, guilt, maybe even desperation. And yet Joseph chose to frame it differently, to credit her rather than blame her. That generosity of spirit was something she could hardly comprehend. As the days rolled on, Evelyn began to notice things she had never paid attention to before. The way Joseph's eyes lit up when he talked about his ideas. The quiet determination with which he approached every challenge. The humility that made people trust him instantly. And slowly, against her will, admiration gave way to something deeper, something she didn't dare admit, not even to herself. Joseph, on the other hand, remained cautious. Though he respected Evelyn's growing humility and admired her intelligence, the wound of that first day had not completely healed. He remembered the sting of her laughter, the way she had dismissed him without hesitation. And yet, he also saw the changes in her, the sincerity in her apologies, the effort she made to listen, the way she was learning from him rather than trying to dominate. It was one Friday afternoon, during a company meeting, that everything shifted. The board gathered, eager to hear the results of Joseph's initiatives. Charts showed growth, customer feedback glowed with positivity, and morale surveys reached numbers that hadn't been seen in years. One executive turned to Joseph, his expression filled with respect. "Young man, what you've done here is nothing short of remarkable. You've given us back our future." The room erupted in applause. For a brief moment, Joseph allowed himself to feel the weight of it, the recognition, the validation, the acknowledgement that his ideas had value. He thought of his mother, of the nights spent hunched over borrowed books, of the day he walked through these doors and was laughed at. The journey from that moment to this one felt surreal. But then Evelyn stood, raising her hand for silence. All eyes turned to her. "I have something to say," she began, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "None of this would have been possible without Joseph. I wronged him once. I humiliated him when all he asked for was a chance. And yet, he forgave me. He gave me, and this company, another chance when we didn't deserve it. That is leadership. That is strength. And I will never forget it. The room fell silent. Her confession was raw, unfiltered, and vulnerable in a way none of them had ever seen from her before. Joseph's chest tightened. To hear her say those words publicly, to acknowledge what had happened, meant more to him than he could express. When the meeting ended, Evelyn approached him quietly. I meant every word, she said. You've not only saved this company, Joseph. You've saved me from myself. Joseph met her gaze, searching for insincerity, but found none. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that people could change, that even the ones who hurt you most could learn to be better. As they walked out of the building together, side by side, neither spoke of what was slowly blossoming between them. It wasn't the time, but in the unspoken glances, in the quiet respect, in the subtle warmth of their interactions, something undeniable was growing. What had begun with humiliation and pain was slowly transforming into something neither of them had expected. Hope, forgiveness, and perhaps the beginnings of love. The weeks that followed were like a quiet rebirth for both Joseph and Evelyn. On the surface, the company thrived, climbing to new heights with renewed energy. But beneath it all, a subtler, more fragile story was unfolding. It was a story of two people who, against every odd and every expectation, were beginning to find pieces of themselves in one another. Joseph had always kept his life simple. He rented a small apartment, barely furnished, with walls lined by secondhand books and a tiny window that overlooked the bustling city streets. Each morning he carried his worn leather notebook, the one filled with dreams and sketches of ideas he used to think would never see daylight. That notebook had become a symbol of his persistence, a reminder that his voice mattered. And now he wasn't the only one who thought so. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself questioning everything she had once believed. She used to measure her worth by profits and numbers, by the size of her office and the deference of her employees. But Joseph had shown her another way of seeing the world, a way in which dignity and respect outweighed titles and wealth. She noticed how he treated people, how he listened, how he never acted as though he was above anyone. And she realized that, for all her success, she had lived most of her life starved of that kind of authenticity. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, Evelyn found herself outside Joseph's modest apartment. She didn't know what had driven her there, only that she couldn't shake the thought of him. She stood nervously in the hallway, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing. Finally, she knocked. Joseph opened the door, surprise flashing across his face when he saw her. "Evelyn?" he asked, stepping back instinctively. She looked uncertain, almost fragile. I hope I'm not intruding." He shook his head. "No, come in." Inside, the apartment was exactly as she expected, humble, neat, filled with books and papers stacked in careful piles. It was so different from her polished world, and yet it felt alive. She sat on the edge of his old sofa, her eyes taking in the little details of his life. A faded photograph of his mother stood on a small table. On the wall, scribbled notes and quotes were pinned like reminders of who he wanted to be. "You've built something out of nothing," she said softly. "This place, it's you." Joseph shrugged with a sheepish smile. "It's not much, but it's mine. I don't need much, Evelyn. Just enough to live, to dream, to keep going." She looked at him then, her eyes lingering longer than they should have. "And yet you've given this company more than I ever could with all my wealth. You've given it life again." Joseph lowered his gaze. "I just did what I thought was right. People needed to be heard. Sometimes that's all it takes." The silence that settled between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Evelyn felt her chest tighten, the weight of a question pressing against her lips. "Joseph," she whispered, "do you hate me for what I did that day? For humiliating you?" He looked up, meeting her eyes with a steady calm. "I don't hate you, Evelyn. I won't lie, it hurt. For a long time I carried that pain with me. But hate? No. If I had let myself hate you, I wouldn't be here today. Forgiveness freed me. It gave me the strength to keep going. His words undid something inside her. She had spent years building walls, protecting herself with pride and authority, but with him, those walls crumbled. She felt her throat tighten as tears threatened. "You're stronger than I'll ever be," she said. Joseph shook his head. "Strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being broken and still choosing to love, to forgive, to try again." For the first time in her adult life, Evelyn allowed herself to cry, not out of weakness, but out of the sheer release of everything she had carried for so long. And Joseph, who had once been the object of her scorn, was now the one who sat beside her, offering comfort not with words, but with the quiet presence of someone who truly understood pain. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected. They didn't call it love. Not yet. But it was something real, something undeniable. Evelyn started joining Joseph in small, ordinary things. A cup of coffee in a modest cafe near his apartment. A walk through the park on Sunday mornings. Evenings spent talking not about business, but about life. She told him about her childhood, about the pressure she had faced to be perfect, about the loneliness that came with power. And Joseph, in turn, shared stories of growing up with nothing but his mother's unwavering faith, of nights spent studying under flickering street lamps, of the rejection that had fueled his determination. For Evelyn, it was a revelation. For Joseph, it was healing. Yet, not everyone in the company approved. Whispers began to circulate, executives questioned Evelyn's judgment, and some employees wondered if Joseph's rise was too sudden, too close to the boss. The rumors stung, but Joseph refused to let them divide him from what he knew was real. One day, after a tense board meeting where Evelyn was openly criticized for her closeness to Joseph, she stormed out, her composure cracking. Joseph followed her into the hallway. "They don't understand," she muttered, pacing angrily. "They think you're just some project. That I'm blinded by something other than your brilliance." Joseph touched her arm gently, stopping her. "Evelyn, let them talk. You don't need to prove anything to them. You know the truth. I know the truth. That's enough." Her eyes softened, the fury in them dissolving into gratitude. "How can you be so calm? Don't you care what they say?" He smiled faintly. "I've been called worse, Evelyn. I've been laughed at, dismissed, thrown out. But I've learned that people's opinions don't define me, and they won't define us either." For the first time, Evelyn realized that Joseph was no longer the desperate young man standing at her office door, begging for a chance. He was a man who had earned his place, not just in the company, but in her life. And as the days passed, that place grew more undeniable. Their bond deepened, woven by shared laughter, quiet confessions, and the slow but certain merging of two hearts that had once lived in very different worlds. It was during one of their late-night walks, under the dim glow of city lights, that Evelyn finally allowed herself to whisper what she had been holding back. "Joseph, I don't know when it happened, but I can't imagine my life without you in it." He stopped, turning to her, his breath catching in the cool night air. For a moment, he said nothing, searching her face for the sincerity he already knew was there. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. "I felt the same way, Evelyn. I just never thought someone like you could ever." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But maybe it's not about who we were. Maybe it's about who we've become together." The city hummed around them, but in that moment, it felt as though the world had gone quiet, holding its breath for the two of them. For the first time, Evelyn, the powerful, untouchable woman who had built her life on control, felt completely vulnerable. And Joseph, the humble young man who had once been cast out of her office, felt completely whole. Their story was far from over. The challenges ahead would test them both. But what had begun as humiliation and pride had transformed into something neither of them could deny. A love forged in forgiveness, humility, and the courage to change. Life has a way of weaving circles, where the very place you were once dismissed can become the stage where your triumph is revealed. For Joseph, that circle was about to close. The company that had once shut its doors on him now sought him out, not as a desperate applicant, but as a visionary leader they desperately needed. The irony was not lost on him. He remembered the humiliation, the sting of rejection, and the shame he had carried that day when he was told he didn't belong. But now, as he prepared to step into the boardroom, invited by the very executives who once ignored his existence, he realized something profound. This was not about revenge. It was about purpose, growth, and the undeniable truth that no one's worth is determined by the opinions of others. The day was warm, with golden sunlight spilling across the skyline of the city. Joseph's reflection in the glass doors of the towering building was almost unrecognizable to himself. He stood tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that represented not just success but dignity. Every thread seemed to carry the weight of his journey, from the small apartment where he had studied late into the night, to the long hours he had invested in building his own business, to the sacrifices that tested his will. He was not the boy who had come begging for a chance. He was now the man who had created opportunities, not only for himself but for others who believed in him. As he entered the lobby, his heart was steady. The receptionist, polite and cheerful, immediately recognized him, though not from personal memory but from the countless articles, interviews, and profiles that had emerged over the past year. Joseph had become a name synonymous with resilience, a symbol of how humility and determination could rewrite destinies. His story had spread like wildfire, inspiring young dreamers across the city, reminding them that rejection was not the end of the road, but often the beginning of a greater journey. "Good morning, Mr. Joseph," the receptionist greeted warmly. "They're expecting you upstairs." He nodded with a smile and took the elevator, watching the floors climb higher. Each chime felt like a heartbeat, steady and purposeful. He wasn't nervous. He had already faced worse: poverty, ridicule, loneliness. This meeting was nothing compared to the battles he had fought within himself. The nights when doubt had tried to strangle his dreams. The mornings when he forced himself to rise despite exhaustion. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped into the executive floor. A group of directors was waiting for him, and among them was the manager who had humiliated him years ago. Her name was Clarissa, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her ruthless dismissal of those she deemed unworthy. Time had not softened her features, but her eyes betrayed something Joseph had never seen before: unease. She knew who he was now, and the memory of their first encounter seemed to hang between them like an unspoken truth. "Joseph," the CEO began, extending his hand, "thank you for meeting with us. We've all heard of your achievements, and frankly, we're impressed. What you've done with so little support is remarkable. Our company is facing challenges, and we believe your vision, your perspective, could be exactly what we need." Joseph shook his hand, maintaining his composure. He listened carefully as they outlined their struggles: declining innovation, a culture that had grown stagnant, employees disengaged and uninspired. Ironically, the very arrogance and blindness that had dismissed Joseph years ago had now left them vulnerable. They needed a leader who understood struggle, someone who had walked through the fire and come out stronger. As they spoke, Joseph glanced at Clarissa. She avoided his eyes at first, but eventually their gazes met. In hers, he saw something unexpected. Not pride, not superiority, but regret. Perhaps time had humbled her too. Perhaps she had realized that the way she treated people mattered, that dismissing someone's worth could not only ruin a moment but haunt a conscience for years. When the discussion ended, they turned to Joseph. "So," the CEO said, "will you consider joining us? Will you help us bring this company back to life?" Joseph paused, letting the silence stretch. He could feel the weight of the moment, the eyes watching him, the irony thick in the air. He remembered his younger self, standing outside this very building, rejected, humiliated, broken. That boy had once wished for this moment, had once dreamed of proving them wrong. But Joseph was no longer driven by bitterness. He had grown past it. "I appreciate the offer," he began, his voice calm but firm. "And I appreciate the recognition. But you see, when I came here years ago, desperate for a chance, I was told I wasn't good enough. That day, I walked out humiliated, but it pushed me to build something on my own. And today I stand here not because you accepted me, but because I accepted myself. My worth was never defined by this company or by the people who rejected me. There was a silence in the room, heavy with truth. Clarissa shifted uncomfortably, her guilt visible. Joseph continued, I didn't come here to take revenge or to bask in irony. I came here because I believe in something bigger than myself. I believe in second chances, in building cultures where people are valued not for where they come from, but for what they're willing to give, for the passion they carry inside them. If I choose to work with you, it won't be to save this company. It will be to save the people within it, the young men and women who might be standing where I once stood, waiting for someone to believe in them. The CEO leaned back, visibly moved. For a moment, the entire room seemed to shift. They weren't just speaking to a potential partner. They were listening to a leader whose words cut through pride and ego, straight into the heart of what leadership truly meant. Finally, Joseph turned to Clarissa. Their eyes locked once more, and this time he addressed her directly. And to you, I want to say, your words hurt me once. They could have crushed me, but they also pushed me to grow. I don't hold bitterness anymore. I forgive you, because carrying resentment would only weigh me down. But I hope you remember that how we treat others matters. A single sentence, a single moment of cruelty can stay with someone for years, and a single act of kindness can change a life. Tears welled in Clarissa's eyes, though she tried to hide them. For the first time in her career, she was speechless. She saw not just the man Joseph had become, but the mirror of her own failings. And in that reflection, she realized the power she had wasted by using her position to belittle rather than to uplift. The meeting ended, but the impact lingered. Joseph eventually agreed to collaborate with the company, not as a desperate employee, but as a partner whose vision would reshape its future. He implemented programs that gave opportunities to underprivileged youth, internships for those who lacked formal education but carried raw talent, mentorship for employees overlooked by rigid hierarchies. Slowly, the culture of the company transformed. Innovation returned, not from the top, but from the hearts of employees who finally felt seen and valued. As for Clarissa, her journey of redemption began in that very meeting. Humbled and reflective, she approached Joseph later, in private. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't see you then. I judged you unfairly, and I've lived with that mistake. Thank you for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I will try to honor it. Joseph smiled softly. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. If you truly regret it, then use your position to lift others, not to tear them down. That's how you'll honor it. And so, a story that had begun with humiliation ended with reconciliation and growth. Joseph had turned rejection into fuel, pain into purpose, and humiliation into humility. He proved that no matter how the world may try to define you, your worth is written not by their judgments but by your resilience, your choices, and your ability to rise again. Years later, when people spoke of Joseph, they didn't just speak of his success. They spoke of his heart, his ability to forgive, his unwavering belief in people. He became more than a leader. He became a light, guiding others out of their darkest rejections into the brilliance of their own potential. And the boy who once walked away from that company, shoulders heavy with shame, became the man who walked back in, not for validation, but for transformation. His story was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about proving that no matter where you start, no matter how far you fall, greatness is always within reach for those who dare to believe. That was Joseph's legacy. That was his victory, and it was more powerful than he could have ever imagined.